everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be doing my reading wrap up for March. In March I read 10 books and DNF'd one. I also read the entirety of one series, which I did for a reading vlog. And overall I feel like I had a pretty good reading month. There was only one book that I would consider kind of a dud, and the rest of them I gave above a 3.5 stars, which is kind of like my threshold for a good book for me. I also only ended up buying one book, which wasn't really like I bought a book. It was like I bought a ticket for a book signing that came with a free book. And I'll talk more about that in my April wrap up probably. But let's go ahead and take a look at all of the books I read this month. This time around, I think I'm going to go in like intended audience order. So I'm going to talk about my middle grade books first, then YA, then adult. So first off, we are going to be talking about the entirety of the original Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan. I read the 5 books in the original series for a reading vlog of reading these books for the first time. So in that video, I read The Lightning Thief, Sea of Monsters, The Titan's Curse, Battle of the Labyrinth, and The Last Olympian. These are a middle grade fantasy series that follows our main character Percy Jackson, who is this troubled kid that's kind of just been bouncing from school to school his whole life, and he can't seem to understand why terrible things keep happening to him. But when he is 12 years old, he gets attacked by a monster who is masquerading as his math teacher. And from that, he learns he is a half-blood, which is a demigod child of a human and a god. And because monsters will try to seek out half-bloods and kill them, he has to go to Camp Half-Blood, which is protected by a magical border that keeps all the monsters out. And each installment is kind of like a different goofy travel adventure novel, as him and a different group of friends is trying to find like some magical artifact, fighting different monsters from Greek myths, and meeting different Greek gods. There is kind of like an overarching story where the big bad is the Titan Kronos, who is trying to regain his power and overthrow Mount Olympus. So a lot of the books in this series follow them trying to gain some magical item or seek out the help from a certain person to help them in their fight against Kronos. I would say I like this series as like a 4-star overall. I gave all the books in the series 4 stars except for the last one, The Last Olympian, which I gave 5 stars. I feel like that one, at least for me, hit home a lot more of the like emotional and like thematic elements that were kind of brought up throughout the course of the series and really told them in a really poignant way. I feel like the series works not just for like the intended audience of middle schoolers, but also for older readers as well. As I said in my vlog, I think it has a lot of like kind of cute, cozy fantasy elements in that all of the like monsters or their figures from Greek myths will get like modernized to have like more like mundane jobs, but are still very like kooky or over the top in their presentation. I think that you really see all of the characters go through a lot of growth over the course of the series, especially since it takes place over the course of like 4 years. So you see Percy go from this more like insecure and confused like 12-year-old to a much more competent and strong leader when he's 16. Overall, I really like Percy as the main character. I think he's really funny, and a lot of the things that he would think in his mind I would laugh out loud at. And I feel like he has a very strong and clear voice that comes from the very first chapter. Overall, I really like this series, and I definitely will be continuing on with reading more of the like Percy Jackson extended universe. Like I said in the original video, I've never read these as a kid. This was my first time reading it, and I really enjoyed my time checking them out. So that was all of the middle grade books that I read, which was again 5 books and was basically half of what I read in March. Now let's move on to the YA books I read, of which there's only one of them, and that was Teach the Torches to Burn by Caleb Roeg. Teach the Torches to Burn is an Romeo and Juliet retelling that is part of the Remixed Classics series, and it basically follows the same storyline as Shakespeare's play, with the change of Romeo falling for Valentine, who is the younger brother of Mercutio. I didn't know this going in, but I did look it up after the fact, that Valentine isn't actually an OC. He is what's called a ghost character from the original play, who I guess is someone who is named but doesn't have any speaking lines. So I think that his like kind of expanded role in this version of the story is a really good addition. Although at the same time, I do think it's a little bit of a strange choice for like a Romeo and Juliet retelling. I feel like they are like the pinnacle of forbidden love iconography. So it feels like kind of a no-brainer to me that you would instead have a like gender-swapped Juliet as the romance for your book about forbidden gay love. That being said, I actually really do like the version of Juliet we meet in this story. She's an ace queen who is basically trying to just marry Romeo so that she can run away with someone and get her family off her back. I also thought the thematic elements were done really well and definitely fell along the same lines as the original play, in terms of being about like seeking out your own happiness instead of just doing whatever your family thinks is best for you. My biggest complaint, and thus why I didn't rate this higher than a 3.5 stars, is that it's still just a Romeo and Juliet retelling. And I'm not like a huge Shakespeare fan, so while I'm sure a lot of people would be entertained by this, I'm not like as emotionally attached to it. And I also think that this, in being a retelling, there's not a ton that can be done to make these characters beyond actually what I mentioned about Juliet's character. I feel like because you have to stay loyal to the original structure of the play, we miss out on really like exploring the characters' personalities and also their interactions on a deeper level. There are some of those moments earlier on, but the second half with like the poison plot line, I've always found that plot line to be kind of stupid, so I was like, ugh, we have to deal with this again now. However, I did like the very final end of this book, and overall I did enjoy my time reading it. It definitely took me a while to read this. I think I started this at the very beginning of March and I didn't finish it until like yesterday, but I'm glad I read it and I do recommend it. Okay, now let's move on to all of the adult books that I read. The first one of those, I'm going to quickly touch on the one DNF that I had, which was Feybound by Sara L Arifi. This book is a fantasy romance that follows two elven sisters, Yuren and Lettel. Yuren is in the military and she ends up making this like huge error that costs a bunch of lives, and because of that she ends up getting banished into exile. And from that, her sister Lettel decides to follow her and bring her back. It is a combo FF romance, so Yuren has a female love interest, and then Lettel is in an MF romance with one of Yuren's subordinate officers who is traveling with her to help find Yuren. This book was Katie's Readings Patreon book pick for March, and I decided to DNF it around like 20 to 25% of the way through. I was just kind of bored, and I just felt like it didn't have like that spark for me right from the beginning. I think at like 13%, I knew that if I kept reading this, it would be like a 3-star read. And then I was like, okay, this is also the start of a series, and I know I'm not going to want to read the next one. And kind of like looking ahead to see if I would be interested in it. I think there is spice, and normally I am like all for trying to find FF romances with spice in them. But I saw a review that basically said both of Yuren's love interests are bad and kind of like use her for their own gain. And I'm just like not really interested in that. And I don't think I'm alone in my thoughts, because I think a lot of other people in Katie's Patreon, like Discord, said similar things for their reviews, so I feel like I'm justified in DNFing it. It could also be I just wasn't in like the right mood for it, so this probably would work for someone else, but I just don't know if I'll ever come back to it. Okay, moving on to the next book I wanted to talk about. I read Voyage of the Damned by Frances White. This is a adult fantasy murder mystery. It follows our main character Ganymedes, or D, who is one of the heirs to be a ruler of one of these like provinces in this big fantasy kingdom. He has to go on this like symbolic voyage with the 11 other heirs as part of this big ritual holiday. And D is hiding the fact that unlike all the other heirs, he does not have any magical powers, which is kind of related to this bigger scandal with his family. So he's like pretending to still have magical powers. Well, on the boat, one of the other heirs dies, and D is like, this person was murdered and we have to find the culprit. And it then becomes a like locked room murder mystery with a fantastical backdrop. This book was so good. D is a main character after my own heart. He's a really like messy fail wife, which is really like my bread and butter archetype. He also has a huge crush on his childhood best friend who is now acting like he doesn't know him, and D is very hung up about that. He's also trying to make people not like him because that way they won't get too close and learn his secret that he doesn't have magic like all the others. But in trying to be antagonistic, he comes across as endearing, at least to me he does. And this author, you can tell she's a cosplayer with the way that everyone is like really fun and colorful. And this cast is very diverse along a lot of different lines. I also felt that the murder mystery element was really fun and fast-paced, and I had no idea who the murderer was going to be. I really liked this a lot, but there was one thing that is a spoiler, but it made me like irrationally mad. And I think it made me like the story a little bit less once this got revealed. I think if it had been done differently, I might have been a little bit more okay with it, but with the way it played out, it definitely made me dislike the romance angle of the book more. However, I really did like the lore and like world building, and I feel like it made sense both in like the context of the story, but also had like a relevance in like the thematic lesson that D has to learn about himself. Overall, really enjoyed this book. Glad it was in a Lumicrate pick that I ended up taking. I'm gonna give this one 4 stars. I think this book also was originally only published in the UK, but it has since gotten a US release. So hopefully more people will be able to check it out now. And I definitely would be interested in checking out anything that Frances White has coming out in the future. Okay, the next book I read was The Honey Witch by Sydney J. Shields. This is a Regency era fantasy romance that follows our main character Marigold, who is dreading her predictable life of trying to find a husband and settle down, when she gets a visit from her grandmother who tells her that they are a family of witches, and as the eldest daughter she can come live with her on this island of Innisfree and become a honey witch. Marigold is like, of course, this is like the solution to all of my problems, but her grandmother does warn her that their family line has a curse on them so that they can either only have their magic or true love. And as long as she's a honey witch, no one will be able to love her. This book is like a cottagecore checklist of all of the vibes. They're picking flowers, they're running through meadows and swimming in magic ponds, they're doing beekeeping, making herbal remedies. It has it all. I really was enjoying the early section of this book with Marigold and her grandmother living on Innisfree, and her training and all like the accompanying cottagecore elements I mentioned before. The real problem definitely came in with the introduction of Lottie as the love interest. I was a bit confused about some like lore elements of the world because I thought that in the beginning section, Marigold was kind of rejecting the conventions of society of her having to marry a husband, but then it becomes revealed that Marigold has had relationships with women as well, and that both her best friend August and her younger brother Frankie are in relationships with men, like pretty openly. So I guess this is a world where homophobia doesn't exist. And normally I'm not like disappointed by a book's lack of homophobia, but I feel like it kind of like muddled Marigold's overall motivations. That's why she was so like upset about having to marry a guy when she could have just married a woman just as easily instead. I feel like it would have been better if all of that had been defined a little earlier on. And then the theming of Marigold wanting to like leave be more about her feeling strange or like stifled with putting up snobby appearances in high society. And then her wanting to run away from that and go to Innisfree to become a witch be more about her being more true to herself. I also feel like this book would have been better if Marigold was like Ace or Aro, and there was a more focus on her learning like, yeah, I don't need romantic love, but I do still need connection, and in finding a way for her to show platonic love to her friends and family. I really just didn't like the romance that she had with Lottie. I feel like Lottie is like so rude for the majority of the book. Lottie is really rude to her when they first meet for seemingly like no reason. And it just was really off-putting, and I couldn't understand why Marigold was attracted to her. I just feel like we didn't really need to contend with this semi-enemies to lovers plot line when Marigold had like a lot of other stuff going on that would have been more interesting to focus on. There's a lot of scenes where Marigold and her best friend August are interacting. It just made me feel like they had way more chemistry, and I would have wanted him or Lottie with August's personality to be the love interest instead. That being said, the more like spicy scenes, even without like outright smut, were very well paced and well written. They kind of made me feel like the characters had chemistry even when I hadn't noticed it prior to those scenes. So if this is what Cindy J. Shields can write in a scene where I thought the characters had no chemistry beforehand, I'd be excited to see what she can do when there's a romance I'm actually rooting for. This actually was a book I was originally planning to read in April, but I ended up getting started a little bit early and ended up finishing it before the end of the month. And it's going to be probably featured again in a future reading vlog I have coming up that'll talk about this book and a couple other ones as well, so stay tuned for that video. Okay, the next book I wanted to talk about is The 50-Year Sword by Mark C. Danielewski. This book is very hard to explain. It's not as complicated as House of Leaves, which is Mark C. Danielewski's more famous book. It's a novella that's kind of like experimental poetry in a lot of ways, that follows a story within a story that this man is telling to these 5 orphans about this voyage he went on to try and find this magical sword. I really like the formatting of this book, and I think it has really good atmosphere. The book itself also is incredibly beautiful, and the design and like stitching elements of it are so good. And I also feel like a lot of it does have relevance to the plot. Here's kind of an example of some of the like inventive like stitching work. And then this back section that you have to flip like one at a time sideways. Love that part. I feel like it is kind of like apples and oranges comparing House of Leaves to this, because House of Leaves is obviously way better. In that book, there's definitely a lot more to like grab onto and think about. In terms of more like difficult to read literature, I'm much more of a sifting through a lot to find the secrets versus pondering very minimal language to find double meanings. So I feel like that's why I like House of Leaves more. If you're a person that likes kind of like weird poetry and inventive book design, you'll like this. Okay, the last book I wanted to talk about is the only nonfiction I read this month, which was Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devin Price. This is a nonfiction book that focuses on the experiences of masked autistics, which is basically the experience of intentionally or unintentionally hiding or appearing to act like an autistic person by dampening down your autistic traits. The author, Devin Price, was a person who was diagnosed as autistic later in life, and he talks to a lot of other autistic people who fell outside the normally understood view of what an autistic person should look like, to then get a better understanding of what autism is and how it's diagnosed and treated. The author then talks about how people can unmask and make their lifestyles better suited to their needs, and how unmasking can help both autistic people and allistic people alike if a shared worldview of the benefits unmasking were held. I really like this book and gave it a 4.5 stars. I felt very seen in some of the lists that Devin Price gives of typical like masked autistic traits, and I feel like his validation of self-realized autistics was very comforting. I do think the center dragged a little bit, which is why it's like a 4.5 stars over like a 5 stars. But I really liked a lot of the later chapters that focused on changes that autistic people can make to their spaces to be more autistically friendly, and also the importance in finding community with others. And the ending felt like it left off on a very powerful note that made me feel very proud and honored to be amongst a really incredible community. So that is a look at all of the books I read in March. Even though this I think is the highest number of books I've read in a single month, most of these books I read in the first like 2.5 weeks, and the last like week and a half I was basically focusing on other things. I had a lot of like life stuff come up, both like positive and negative. So I really haven't been reading as much recently, and I'm really hoping that's not going to put a huge damper on my output for April. Hopefully I will bounce back by the middle of the month. Anyway, that is going to be it for this video. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, or subscribing if you aren't already. Consider also following me on Storygraph if you'd like to see my reading updates in real time. And also following my Bookstagram, which is linked in the description. But that is going to be it for me today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!